All right, in this episode, me and Chuck Moxley, we're going to break down how to land fractional roles predictably by putting less efforts and using podcasting to be more specific. We're going to break down if it's worth building your own podcast or being a guest, how to build a strategy, how to repurpose content, and of course, how to make sure you put in less time into this but get more pipeline and clients from this.
Um, there's something I'm really interested in when it comes to being a fractional CMO. Is that first of all, why did you transition? I mean, being 6 times CMO for SaaS. The last thing you want to think about. I mean, that's a trend in marketing. People were rebellious, but why did you decide to go fractional?
You know, I had the opportunity, I'll put it that way. I had the opportunity where I was full time and the company just, they cut back enough they didn't need full time. And so the opportunity presented itself. And what I was finding was in the last couple of times I was looking for a job, I do a lot of startups and I am not 25 years old, right? I have, 30 years experience. So what I was finding was I'd go through 9 or 10 interviews and it would come down to me and one other person and they go with somebody else. So it was one of those things I was going, my experience, I'm almost too experienced and I'm too senior but when I took that exact same experience and I said, I'm going to be a fractional where you're just going to get a slice of me, suddenly I was in demand. Suddenly I was valuable as a fractional more so than a full time, at a startup where the CEO is 35. So I don't know. It was just basically taking the same exact product and repositioning it, and suddenly I had a lot of interest in it. So
Do, do you, do you think the because it's really different having a skill set and building a business around it? Do you think marketing has helped you a lot? Because not a lot of fractionals, especially CFOs, CTOs, CIOs, they're not familiar with marketing and getting their offering out there. I think. Do you think the experience of being a CMO has helped a lot?
oh sure, yeah, because I intuitively know marketing. The problem is it's like the cobbler's stepchild, right? If you've got 2 or 3 clients and you've got a lot of client work going on, you tend to get buried in that in the doing, and then you don't put a lot of time into the marketing. So having the marketing channels going, keeping that going. I had a conversation with 3 or 4 other fractionals uh, yesterday, and one of them was going like, "Where do you find time to like do a newsletter and stuff?" And honestly, I've had to get some help. I've had to bring in some marketing help to kind of keep my own marketing going. What I will tell you though, that's really different, and I bet a lot, and I hear this from a lot of fractionals. It's really hard to sell you. I could sell software so much easier than I could sell me. That has been the hardest transition for me, and it's been a constant learning. I've gone through a ton of different sales training. I've tried different methodologies. I'm constantly learning, and sometimes botching calls, and then sometimes they go pretty well. So I'm in a massive learning curve right now, just trying to figure out how to sell me.
Yeah. Even the having budget and not having budget plays a big difference. I mean, when you're a CMO, I mean, you have budget to spend, but when you're solo, I mean, you kind of have something to spend, but it's not going to be as easy as having someone else's money. I mean, you kind of scare money doesn't make money, basically. I'm curious. Do you think back then when you transitioned as a fractional, do you think it was as competitive as now? Because that's one of the things that I'm always curious about. How was it back then?
I think it feels more competitive now, and I wrote about this on LinkedIn. I really, for the longest time before, while I was full time, and I'd see somebody who was a marketer, and suddenly they say fractional marketer. In the back of my head, I was going, that means they can't get a job. They're calling themselves fractional marketer until they get a job. I feel terrible saying that, but I actually wrote a post on this on LinkedIn. And then when I had the opportunity to go fractional, I honestly, Hamza, I didn't know the first thing about it. I knew the term, but I didn't know the first thing about how to set it up. So podcast, I'm a big podcast listener. So that weekend I went, when I had made that decision, that weekend I went, I go, there's got to be a podcast on this. And I found one from a guy named Casey Stanton on being a fractional CMO. And I ended up, Casey runs an accelerator called CMOX, where they basically teach you how to be a fractional CMO. They give you all the methodology, all the forms, they go through a coaching program, all that kind of stuff, how to position yourself. So I actually signed up for that program, went through the CMX program, which taught me. And I now have 30, 40 friends that have all gone through the program. So it's been a great community as well. I've learned from and I talk to on a regular basis. But back to your point, back then, and when I'm saying back then, it's a year and a half. It's not like did this 10 years ago, right? I felt like it was a little bit more unique. Now I'm seeing so much fractional that there's actually a lot of buzz about. I'm thinking about taking fractional CMO out of my LinkedIn bio because it's become so trite, and a lot of people are doing it. And a lot of people, there's this. We talked about the fractional CMO with 5 years experience, there's all these fractionals getting labeled on fractional demand gen, fractional product marketing, fractional, and I still don't know that the market understands it. Now, I had somebody who came to my website. They found me on Google, came to my website last week, booked a meeting with me, came on the call, and they were like, "We're looking for a fractional CMO." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, you know what it is?" Most of the time I have to explain what it is. And they had already hired 2 fractionals in the last 10 years, a fractional CTO, fractional product person, and they got it. They understood it. So we cut through a lot of the process because they already knew what a fractional CMO was, but they're unusual. Most of the time I'm explaining that concept and I'm trying to say, like I just came off a call where they're going, well, now I've seen like agencies that come in or marketing firms come in, they spend a bunch of money and they don't. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not a firm. I'm not an agency. I'm a CMO. I'm your marketing guy. So I spend a lot of time explaining it still, which then going back to your original question, when there are thousands, there's some counts of like 100,000. I'm like, how can there be that many people in a market that the buyers half the time don't even know what they're buying?
Yeah, I mean, especially now, everybody's calling themselves fractionals. I mean, whoever got a content course, they're a fractional now suddenly.
Exactly. And that's why I have toyed with the idea of taking fractional CMO out of my bio, but somebody made a good point. If somebody is searching for a fractional CMO on LinkedIn, then you won't show up in the search.
Yeah, it's ranking higher now, even articles. I'm really curious. I mean, especially in marketing, there's this debate that's been going on. Perhaps it's just a mini debate. When I'm talking to a fractional CTO or CFO, they would say, well, fractional CMOs have it easy. They just know how to do marketing. And I say, well, when it's easier to call yourself a fractional CMO specifically, then there are thousands of people doing the same thing. And it always begs the question, how do you differentiate yourself?
Oh, that is always a challenge, is differentiating yourself. And the thing that I've got going for me is done this, I've been a CMO for 20 some years, right? I've got a ton of case studies. So that's one of the first things when I built out a website, I put like 10 case studies on there. I have another 10 I could do. I just haven't sat down. In fact, I've gone back to some of the old documents to pull some numbers. I just need to pull them out. That has helped me. Like I'm posting on LinkedIn, and I've had some posts go 10,000, 15,000 views. I've had a couple pop out over 100,000, over 200,000. So, and it's usually case study driven. When I talk about a really interesting case study, like ungating content or narrowing down an ICP or some sort of concept like that, that's helped me get exposure. And I use that in sales calls. When I get into it, I start talking about here's what I've done for companies. And if I'm talking to the right kind of company, they appreciate that. They know that that I've got legit case studies. So I think that's the easiest thing. And by the way, that's what separates me from the person with 5 years experience because they don't have.
Experience. I mean, the amount of years you spend doing the same thing, and also, most importantly, the case studies. I mean, I always emphasize whenever I'm working with a client, I try to make sure that even though there are NDAs involved, we try to respect them, but it's always about proving you've been there and done that, and I think that's where I think with just fractional CMOs, if I'm being correct, fractional CMOs have to put in a lot of work to acquire clients, unlike CFOs. There's every I said everybody calls themselves fractionals. There are some people that have that much experience that can be a good fit for the company and be a fractional CMO, but the majority are not. Kind of, I don't know how to describe this, but when it comes to marketing, there are no set of rules to follow. You know, it's quite a
I think it's because you have an uneducated buyer that they don't know what to make of a fractional CMO. And half the clients I talk to don't even understand marketing, or they've been bitten. They've had bad experiences with marketing. So, and I've ended up, a lot of my background is in SaaS, but I've now been chief marketing officer at a medical device company, and I've worked with other companies. I'm talking to companies that are B2B, but not necessarily SaaS. So I found that I can adapt the same concepts. B2B marketing is B2B marketing. I think in your example of a CFO, everybody knows what a CFO is. Anybody who needs a CFO knows what they need. So, they don't have to spend a lot of time going, well, what's a fractional CFO? It's just, that's kind of self-evident. What does a CFO do? Why do I need a CFO? Marketing is so broad. And there's so many disciplines. Are you a demand marketer? Are you a brand marketer? Are you a content marketer? Are you social marketer? I mean, there's so many different little niches and categories that a lot of people don't even know what they need. And so I think it's market confusion and too many people out there saying too many things that make it hard.
All right, a quick 20 seconds pause to just tell you that this episode is brought to you by our agency. It's called Plum, and we work exclusively with fractional executives to help them land retainers predictably while also raising their pricing, and why not scale beyond a 1% operation. We're offering a free 35-minute power call with no strings attached, not even an upsell. We're not even going to talk about what we do. We're just going to hop into that call, give you all of the knowledge that we have. You can implement those things and land retainers predictably. So feel free to reach out to me through LinkedIn, and always happy to help. Enjoy the episode.
I would love to talk a little bit about podcasting. I think you've been doing this long enough, right? And when I'm having a chat with a fractional, the majority are asking me, is it worth it, being on podcast or having my own podcast? Like, what do you think?
Again, I've operated a podcast, but for a client, so it's not really my brand; it's their brand, and so I can speak to it from the value to a client, and I do recommend clients consider podcasts in some cases, especially if it's a niche where there aren't a lot of podcasts already. Like in the marketing world, there's a ton of podcasts, so sort of standing out would be a bit of more of a challenge. But if I was talking to my medical device client, that's a much more niche, and there's a lot of education that goes on, a lot of interest. So if it's a good fit, I think it makes sense. But you have to go into it with the right expectation. You have to go into it with the right alignment. I've done. I mean, it's not, and it's very hard to ultimately tie pipeline to podcast. And what I have found, like with the one client where we just dropped episode 69. So we've been doing it like 3 years. We went into it thinking we would be getting clients out of podcast guests. And while some of those did enter into pipeline, none of them closed. However, we have had deals that closed because of the podcast. They were already in play. And my partner on the podcast is our head of sales engineering. So he's working with them. And so when they bring him into a call and it's like, it's Nick, and they're going, oh, you're like Nick from the podcast. It's like he's like a celebrity. And now I've got a celebrity working on my business. And literally he has seen deals close because of that implied credibility from the podcast. That was not at all, when we went into it, how we were thinking about measuring. So part of it is understanding what your goal is and building the podcast in the right way, and then having the right expectation. And there's no one size fits all.
Do you think it's better to start, especially if you're a fractional exec? Do you think it's better to start as a guest or start your own thing right off the bat?
Yeah, that's so much easier. Go be a guest on podcasts. And the benefit of being a guest versus a host is you get to, depending on the format of the podcast, if you're going to interview people like that, like we do, we interview experts mostly. I don't talk a whole lot. I'm asking a bunch of questions, but the expert is the person where they're getting all the value from. So being a guest in a scenario like that is great, because just like you're interviewing me, I'm sharing my experience. You're not talking a lot about your experience. We're talking more about my experience. So that's a great way to showcase expertise or showcase knowledge or that sort of thing. So I definitely recommend, and there's all kinds of ways to go about doing that. And there's enough podcasts out there looking for guests. It's pretty easy to do. The challenge is the opportunity, let me put it that way, is how you then use those assets. Don't just rely on the podcast alone, but you take those assets. And one of the benefits of for me of doing podcasts, is going to be so niche that nobody's ever thought of, but it's been huge, is I go on these podcasts and I talk about a lot of topics, and I talk about my case studies or my experience or how I solve certain problems. I take all of that and feed that back into, I've built an AI skill that is my marketing skill. And I tell it, go listen to this and get all the principles I'm sharing. And it trains it on all my principles. Then I can use that to go build content and go build additional content. And then I've got potentially clips I can pull if I want to include video from it. So that's been one of my biggest benefits of having the podcast, is I fed all that into AI, trained an agent on all of my marketing, and now that agent can do everything, helping me on proposals, helping me on everything, because it knows all my methodologies. And it was easier than me just sitting down and recording 20 hours of my thoughts.
Yeah, even hosting your own thing, especially if that's a new thing to you, you gotta have to set up the camera, light in, kind of prep for the calls and do all those things. I think it's better to start as a guest, but when it comes to repurposing, not even repurposing, do you think you must, as a fractional leader, do you think you should have a strategy in place before even kind of clipping and repurposing the content? Do you think you should have a strategy in place?
Yeah, which I do anyway. I know I work with somebody who helps me on my content. And so we've built out 3 content pillars. And so I look at and I try to talk about topics that are going to fit into the pillars. So I'm intentional when I come on a podcast, what I try to talk about. I'm obviously trying to satisfy what the guest is looking for. I'm sorry, what the host is looking for, and the right content. But within that realm, now I'll go. It's kind of like you heard me on a podcast. That's how we met. Was you heard me on a podcast with a guy named Justin Vialco, I think. I ended up talking all about podcasts on that. We just went down that. That's the business he's in. We went down that rabbit hole. But man, that's great content. It fits right in one of my content pillars. I can now easily repurpose that content. So that's intentional on my part, that I talk within the 3 content pillars anytime I try to do a podcast.
Do you think the model of kind of top of funnel, middle of funnel, bottom of the funnel would be valid in this? I don't think it's still it's as effective. I don't know for other industries, but for fractionals and kind of these complex industries, there isn't something that's called broad content. I mean, that's already too specific to find a broad angle. Do you think you should have kind of the classic LinkedIn strategy: top of funnel, middle of funnel, bottom of the funnel?
I kind of think those concepts, I mean, conceptually, okay, but realistically, the world has changed, right? And so I don't talk about a funnel at all. My whole analogy is a football field. And that what you're trying to do is, and I've talked about this, is the football is the prospect. You're trying to get it from one end of the field down to the other. And so, and the reason I like a football field is because in deals, and so if even a deal with me, like I'll talk to prospects, they're not ready to buy, but maybe 6 months later they come back, right? That happens all the time with deals, any kind of deal, right? That's like a football field. You move it down the football field and then you lose yards and you go back up the football field. Well, that's exactly what happens in a deal. So it just to me is a better visual. But my whole thing, and I'm finding this, I have tried a number of different cold outreaches in for my fractional experience. I've tried LinkedIn, I've tried different vendors, I've tried different things. None of them have worked. I haven't gotten a single client from cold outreach. I've been doing it for probably a year now, 3 or 4 different vendors, 3 or 4 different strategies. But then I have somebody who sees my content or hears about me. So I do think that brand visibility and me showing up and me being out there, and like I mentioned, I had a prospect come in last week that found me on Google. I've tried Googling myself in every way possible. I don't come up. I don't know how they found me, but somehow there was something out there that caused them to come to me. That's a much more qualified prospect than those I get onto a cold call. And that's exactly the same thing salespeople will tell you at SaaS companies. When I've built out programs for them and I'm driving qualified inbound, they will tell you every time those are 10 times better than anybody they're able to get from cold calling. That they happen to get in their car and they go, okay, fine, I'll meet. And they show up for a meeting and they're not in market.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to content in general, like people who are going to buy are just generally lurkers. They don't engage. They're just kind of invisible, right? And they typically kind of book a demo, reach out to you to work with you when they're kind of convinced. Kind of, you've been doing the convincing with the content, if technically speaking.
Right, right. And they're learning, they may be in learning mode going, is a fractional CMO the right thing? So one of my pillars are, what does it mean to be a fractional CMO? What is it? How do you pick a fractional CMO? I'm working on a new lead magnet all about when is it right to get a fractional CMO versus a full-time hire versus an agency versus AI. And that's, the part of that whole decision process. So um, yeah, that I think, and that's why I work so hard at the content, because I think that will pay dividends downstream. But I, just like I tell my clients, it's not going to happen right away. I got to be out there for months, out there posting, out there sharing my point of view, out there connecting. And I think people will come to me as a result of that, and we'll see. And hopefully one day I won't have to do any cold outreach.
Yeah, I'm a cold out. I wouldn't say it's dead, but it's kind of overused. It's a
It
lot.
is, and it's very hard to get meetings and from it. And again, I've gotten meetings, but it's a very high waste, high cost where you have to connect with a ton of people to get meetings, and then you have a bunch of meetings that go nowhere because you caught somebody and they maybe weren't the right prospect. Versus if I'm out there talking about, just like I would tell a client, if you're out there being part of the conversation and raising that visibility, you're going to draw people to you. And Hockey Stack has looked at data across, this is SaaS, but it's true for, I would think, for any category. It's something like 60 plus touches that somebody has to have. They have to engage with your content and get comfortable with you and come to your website a few times. And I see people come to my website. Maybe they check out my ebook and check out that stuff. They'll do that dozens of times before they're ready to have a meeting with me. And that I think is just, it's the same thing I recommend to my clients. I'm now trying to do myself.
Yes, if we can kind of translate this to a fractional leader, I would say that make sure to have a strategy in place, which is at least have your pillars right, have your pillars ready, and then I would say, I think I didn't ask you this, but do you think there's a process to vet podcasts or just accept any invitation? I think there is, but kind of a checklist. Do you think you should have a checklist?
Yeah, yeah, and what I tend to look for, because I do get approached for a lot of podcasts, and I don't accept them all. I'll tell you the exact process I go through, and I think when we're going out and trying to find guests, they go through the same process. Is this going to be worth my time? And so if I go to the YouTube channel and they have 3 views on their videos, I'm like, for me to get in front of 3 people, is that worth it? If I go to the YouTube channel and they got some videos that have got thousands of views or hundreds of views or even dozens of views, and they're in the right target market, now I'm going, okay, well, that's probably worth it. I'm going to get some exposure. And you can't see the actual podcast. So if they're putting it on Spotify and all that stuff, unless you're like a top 10, which nobody is in this category, I don't know what their kind of distribution is there. But I do know from running a podcast that our YouTube tends to be better than our video tends to be better, especially our shorts get thousands of views, but we don't have many episodes that get thousands of listens on Spotify. So, because we're a niche, we're a very nichey podcast, and that's what I would typically go on. So so I tend to judge it more on YouTube. And if I find somebody who's not doing video, that's a little less interesting to me as well, because again, then I get the video. The audio alone, there's just not that much anymore. Everybody wants video. So that's kind of my criteria. And then I might listen to a couple episodes if it's the right kind of questions. Sometimes I'll get invited to be on a podcast. I'm going like, I don't think I'm qualified. Like the type of questions they're asking, I don't know that I would have the answers for. So I will pass in that case. But most of the time, it's more about, is the juice going to be worth the squeeze, to use a
Mhm.
term from when I lived in the South. If I'm going to, it's an hour, it's not a ton of time, but it's an hour and a half. And then I got to go repurpose it and do all that stuff. Is that going to be worth the time for me to do it? And if I feel like I'm going to get some exposure. Now, you're an exception because you said it's an opportunity to be your first guest. And I'm like, well, I have no data to go on. So I took a shot.
I took the gamble too. Well, um, I, I'm really, really curious, and not just curious. I always wonder if is is it really, really worth kind of using clips only on LinkedIn? I think what we do with whether for myself, well, I stopped posting a long time ago, but for our client and what I've seen on the feed is that video stopped performing like a long time ago. I've just heard today that they're bringing back the video feed in the UK and the US, but in general, video tend to not kind of perform as it used to be. It has some really good benefits that are not measurable, which I'm sure they affect pipeline for sure. But I don't know how to explain fractions. I mean, it's quite a tough thing to believe.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. And we were running a ton of video a year ago when they were really pushing video. They just never figured out how to do video because the post just didn't perform that well. Posts with video didn't perform nearly as well as a static image, or sometimes some of my best performing posts have had no images, no media at all. It's just a really strong story. So I do think, and this goes to your measurable part, the part that's hard to measure. What I've heard about video is it makes you more approachable and gives somebody a perspective, makes you feel real. And so if you put that out and only 100 people see it, but it's 100 of the right people who could hire you, and that makes you more real, that may be a value. I want to do what I want to do, and I haven't had time, is to build out a YouTube page, because YouTube is really good at figuring out the right kind of people who would be interested in your videos and then serving it up. So like our podcast, which again is very niche, our YouTube channel gets over 100,000 views a year on it. And it's because we do the shorts and they get served up in the feeds. We don't care about the money, because I know you don't make as much money off shorts. We could care less about the money. What we care about is the visibility. But if you watch it, now you're going to get another one, and now you're going to get another one and another one. So I've done so much video. I'd love to take a bunch of clips, throw it all up on YouTube and see what it does. I just haven't had time.
For I think video is still worth it. I mean, I always say it. I think as much as it breaks the momentum of engagement, quote unquote, I think it's always worth it. But for taking those interviews and turning them into like the classic LinkedIn post, like an image plus, do you think it's it's still worth kind of building a content engine around those just podcast appearances only? Do you think it's still worth making kind of newsletters, kind of make sure to get the most out of it? Do you think it's technically possible, and does it really do as good as just making your own content, like sitting down, ideating, building the strategy around everything and just producing from scratch?
Yeah, a good question, and I don't know that I know the answer to that. One of the things I've heard what that good podcasts do is, after the fact, if there was a hot take, they'll kind of re-record it as a hot take to go on video, because you need the first 7 seconds to really catch somebody, especially on YouTube, which I haven't done, by the way. But so I don't know. I don't know yet. I don't know that I know the answer to that question. What I know is, like, my LinkedIn impressions for some reason went down by 84% in May over April. Went down 84%, and I don't know why.
All of
It's
us.
just suddenly everything started tanking, and I was talking to everybody I know was having that issue. So when you do that and you go, well, crap, I've been counting on LinkedIn. I was getting tens of thousands of views, and now I'm getting, nothing. Do I keep putting money? Do I keep putting effort in there, or do I do something I can control, like a newsletter, where I can get people's email addresses? So I'm like building out a Substack right now. I'm trying to do stuff that I can control, and I'm not dependent on an algorithm change on LinkedIn to change what I can do. So, but from a business standpoint, from a client standpoint, where I've seen video perform very well is Insta, Meta, Insta, and Facebook. And so there we do a ton of video and video ads that you can do pretty cheap, because it's a lot cheaper than LinkedIn typically. And they do a pretty good job of getting the right people.
Yeah. I mean, in B2B, I mean, if Meta is pretty underrated. Like
I
you
agree.
you can see.
I agree. I've had great success, and not just in the last year, but for like 5 years. Every client I've put on Meta has done amazing, and it's cheap. It's cheaper than LinkedIn, and you can do so much more. And I don't know why people, every time I've had to push like my demand gen person basically throttle them and go, you got to do Facebook, you got to do Meta, because it's so not thought of as B2B, but for whatever reason, they do a phenomenal job of targeting. And I know because I get targeted. I get targeted with great content and stuff that I'm very interested in. So
Yeah, I mean, when I'm working with a fractional, I think the question is always like, what channel are we targeting? Now, let's say the classic LinkedIn, because it's really hard to convince them to go meta or try things like that. I mean, it's already hard to convince them to do content in the first place. But 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 the thing is, I mean, once you get the strategy down and you know what you're doing, and you're doing these podcast appearances, like you can repurpose the content over and over. I mean, you can turn one episode into 3 newsletters, 4 posts, 2 clips at least.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And that's exactly what we do. What I do for my client with the podcast is that one episode becomes like 15 pieces of content over time. And same thing, even blogs and stuff, to try to get into some of the AEO and all of that. So,
Yeah,
so I agree, and that's why I do the podcast, because, and again, as I mentioned, I also use it to train my AI skill, which is phenomenal, because it's I find that easier. Sometimes I'll be asked by my content person, "Hey, go on video and explain how you do your ICP process." Well, it's really hard to go on when you're not talking to somebody and you're just talking,
yeah,
extemporaneously about a process. Whereas if I was describing my ICP process to you, it'd be far more interesting. So
yeah. I would also say that. I mean, there's some magic about conversations. There's kind of the answers you give when you're in a podcast or when you're asked by someone is totally different than when you're just pressing record by yourself. It's kind of a weird thing. I don't like recording by myself. It's just
no, I hate it. I hate it. I do it. I hate it. But I sometimes do it if I have a topic that she needs me to fill in. And
great. I think we're about 35 minutes in. I have one question. I think it's one of the most repeated question I get from our clients or kind of peers in the industry that are fractionals, and it's like, uh, when it's the right time to kind of really take podcasting that seriously. And I'm talking about doing the same as you guys, where they have a co-host, for example. They're doing their own thing. They're kind of have a department for this, not necessarily a premium agency. They can do it scrappy. But is there any kind of particular indicators that say this is the right time for this?
are you asking as a fractional, like for my own fractional business, or for one of my clients?
As a fractional first.
That's a really tough question. I know there are people who have had great success with it, and I have thought about doing it. I've thought about doing a podcast where I interview CEOs of companies I want to work with and trying that and taking that whole approach. But it's daunting, the idea of, because I know what it takes to produce a podcast. And when we built the podcast for our client, I worked with a podcast agency that did all the graphics, that did originally all the recording and stuff. Today, we still have an agency that does editing for us, post production, that kind of stuff. We don't have it on the front end, but that's because we've been doing it for 3 years, and I know what it takes, and we've kind of got a process down. But it's not insignificant amount of time to build a podcast. It's a pretty big lift, and I think it's why the stats on how many podcasts make it over 6 episodes is like staggering. Like 3% or 5% make it over 6 episodes, because people get in and they go, holy crap, this is a lot of work. So I think if I were doing it, if I were going to do it, I would say this is going to be a limited series. I'm going to produce 6 episodes around a certain topic, and let me see how that goes. And then if I like it and I want to keep it going, great. And if not, I'm not committed to doing more than 6. I kind of created a unit of work that I was willing to commit to, and I'm
Yeah, and there are no downsides. There are no downsides. I mean, if the podcast is something that you're comfortable with and you think you can really pursue consistently, that's good. If not, then you have content to use. Then you're not doing double the effort. So it's a win-win. Regarding, in case you're doing your own thing, is is it kind of recommended to have kind of prospects on as guests? I don't think it kind of converts. But do you have any experience with that?
I've heard varying arguments on it, and we went into it with that expectation because I read the book by James Carberry, who has an agency, and I read his book on that, and that we went into it with that expectation. We never got any of those to convert. Maybe we weren't doing it right, but I found it a hard way to sell. That being the case, I've also heard people who go, yeah, you can absolutely drive pipeline. So I just don't know that I've figured out the right way to do it, but you know, I never say never.
Yeah, never say never. I mean, if we look at it from a strategy standpoint, it's really good to have a conversation with prospects, right? And then you kind of build that relationship, that rapport. But when you come in with the intentions of I'm gonna convert these people, it just doesn't end well. I mean, you kind of
It feels smarmy at times,
yeah,
yeah. And I've had
yeah,
people try to kind of push that. I again, I would the reason I would do it and interview CEOs who might be prospective is because I think the conversation would be more interesting versus me talking with another marketer, me talking with a CEO and understanding what challenges have you had? Why don't you like marketing? Why, what as you think about marketing? I think that could be a very interesting conversation. And I'd learn a ton. And even to your point, even if the podcast doesn't take off and I do 6 episodes, it's like interviewing my prospects in a non-threatening way. So I would learn a ton from it. I'd end up with some great clips. I'd end up with probably something I could pull into, LinkedIn posts and things like that. So to your point, I don't think there's a downside other than the amount of time. It's, that amount of time versus something else.
it's what you make of it. It's what you make of it. I'm personally not a fan of looking for guests based on if they can be a client or not. It's just not a really efficient way to kind of build a brand around that. I think I look first at do they have something really useful? Like you talked about podcasts and at Justin's podcast, and I really enjoyed it. So there's a lot of things about podcasting we can talk about and kind of inform fractionals. Then I look at your past experience, like being a CMO. Then there's a lot of things to learn about marketing. And I think other fractionals can learn a lot from, if I'm being more precise, from fractional executives. And, do you think the problem with kind of using podcast appearances, because this episode is all about podcasting, but do you think about podcast appearances or having your own podcasts is really worth the time, but rather it's how long are you able to stay consistent with it? Because from what I've seen, I think in B2B, if you're a couple of episodes in, you're not going to see nothing. If you're 10, 20, 50, it's when it starts to take off. Do you think there's a kind of a number of how many episodes to kind of test the waters per se?
That's a good question. Again, with this one client, I'm 69 episodes in. It's not, for fractionals, but we do have a following. We have a pretty consistent, loyal audience. We get decent amount of visibility with it, and we've seen it help on the back end of sales. So to me, it's definitely worth it. And it's much easier to get guests now than it was the first 5 guests we've got, right? In fact, we even relied on some clients in our first 5, people who we knew, but now it's pretty easy to get guests because you're out there enough. They go and they check it out and they see who else. That's the other benefit of interviewing like Luminary. Like with that podcast, we're interviewing people from major companies, American Eagle and, Microsoft and Apple and big companies. The guests are going to look and say, well, who else have you had on there? Oh, you've had so and so. Oh, you've had so and so. You've had so and so from this company. Okay, that's a group I want to be positioned in. That's another factor I didn't mention earlier on when you're thinking about evaluating it is what kind of guests do they have? There are certain people I have tremendous industry respect for that if they go on a podcast, I'm like, man, I'd love to be on that podcast. Then I might work to try to be a guest on the podcast because they have so much legitimacy because they had that person. There's a handful, 5 or 10 people that if they get that person, I'm impressed.
Yeah, I think the caliber of the guest affects the. For example, I think if I kind of repurpose this episode and kind of posted about what I learned about marketing from you and what interesting takes, it's always great to have kind of competent guests. And it's hard to find them, by the way. It's easy to go to those directories and find many people calling themselves titles and names, but it's really, really hard to find someone who's, first of all, conversational. You can easy to talk with and just have a good chat. Then there's the competence aspect. Uh, um, do do you think if you're doing your own thing instead of just guesting, you also should have kind of a checklist when it comes to guests?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why with the podcast we do, we actually do a prep call. We do a 30-minute prep call. And that's a chance for us to feel out, are they going to be a good guest? Do they have some interesting points of view to share? Can we come up with an interesting topic? So we kind of brainstorm a topic around that. And I will be honest, we've had a guest or two that by the end we go, yeah, this isn't going to be a fit for us. And we actually reject the guest because we know either they don't have the right experience or they just don't have any presence on a podcast. And it would be like pulling teeth to get it. We love when we get somebody on there who's really lively, who's got something to say and got a point of view. It just makes for a much more interesting episode.
It's also, so it also has to do with, guess the podcast fit. It's really, really hard to kind of not accept podcast appearances, especially when you're starting. Like, I really have to fight with my clients and tell them, listen, you are in manufacturing. This podcast is also about manufacturing, but it's D2C. It's not B2B. There's no value you can bring in unless they can just learn from you. It's kind of a mini workshop technically for them, and they can gonna get some information from you. But it's not gonna be a piece of content or repurposed piece of content that's gonna educate your buyers.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a learning. If you're doing a podcast, you'll learn that as you go through that process. When early with the Frictionless experience, we invited like CEOs. Well, CEOs are too far removed. They couldn't really, and they had their own kind of platitudes to talk about it. And we found that they were kind of boring. They were not the most interesting. The most interesting were a little bit lower people who were the practitioners, who could speak intelligently about how they're, in this case, removing friction from websites and what the impact that was. They had better stories. They were more relevant to our guests. We saw more plays from it. So that was an early learning of, don't shoot for it. We don't want the CEOs. We want the people who know what's going on, the head of e-commerce or the head of product or even a more lower practitioner make better podcast guests.